Howard Goldsmith from Congregation Emanu-El of Westchester in Rye, New York. And I'm here today with Rabbi Ira Ebbin from Ohav Sholom in Merrick, Long Island. And this is Sacred Text Left to Right. Today, we are looking at a seminal text about how to respond to the Shoah, to the Holocaust, as tonight begins Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Ira, would you please introduce the text?
Yes, Howie, thank you so much. The text is written by Emil Fackenheim, and he called the 614th Commandment. And it comes in 4 parts, and I'll read it to you. It says, number 1, we are commanded first to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. We're commanded second to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. We are forbidden thirdly to deny or despair of God, however much we may have to contend with him or with belief in him, lest Judaism perish. We are forbidden finally to despair of the world in the place which is to become the kingdom of God, lest we help it make it a meaningless place in which God is dead or irrelevant and everything is permitted. So Howie, why don't you give us your initial take?
Well, all of this is usually framed in a context which says we need to do or not do these particular things so that we can deny Hitler a posthumous victory. I'm not sure how I dropped that from the text that you just read, but it's always framed that way. These are the things that we need to do in order to deny Hitler a posthumous victory. This is Fackenheim's response to the horrors of the Holocaust, and he often frames it actually as a response to Auschwitz in particular.
Right.
So I observed 2 things from this. The first one, and what always bothers me about this, is that we're looking to Hitler to define a commandment for us. We need to do this in order to deny Hitler a posthumous victory. And even that much gives Hitler too much power. Judaism, in my belief, doesn't need Hitler to motivate our Jewish lives, our Jewish engagement, our Jewish commitments. And in point of fact, if you look at these 4 things, these commandments, these obligations for Jews exist long before World War II, and can exist without any reference to Hitler in particular. And so while I understand Fackenheim's need, indeed the need for all of us to respond to the horrors of the Holocaust as Jews, and to understand as Jews how we can understand our tradition and our people in light of the Holocaust, framing it as a religious commandment of some sort has always disturbed me.
So it's interesting. Your point is very well made, and I'll tell you, we're about the same age, and although you look much older than me, but
it's because I just turned 40, so it's new.
So we're about the same age, and I grew up in a generation growing up where Holocaust survivors were much more available. They were around, and a lot of them, they spoke. No Yom HaShoah went by without hearing from a Holocaust survivor. You'd go to synagogues, you go to shul on Shabbat, and you would talk to people, those who are European, whether they came before or after the war and survived the Shoah. And I remember feeling this presence that's saying, and that where it would often come up, not to give Hitler a victory, that we have to maintain our Judaism because of all the 6 million that perished, and that it became part of the religion, a focus, which was obviously a very dark focus. And I remember thinking that when I became a rabbi, I was going to focus on the positive. That I was, obviously, Holocaust education is important, but it's not the central piece of Judaism. And that I would focus on the positive about that with Jews, as Jews, we celebrate life and not death. I'm at my old age, I'm starting to look things differently a little bit. I was recently listening to a talk by Yossi Klein Halevi, who spoke about growing up with this concept called American Jewish privilege. And the American Jewish privilege is that I'm not responsible to my past, and I don't have to be bound or tied to my past, my Jewishness or my past Jewishness and those who came before me. And listening to this, and he said this upset him so much and nauseated him so much that he felt obliged to move to Israel to ensure that his children will never feel that American Jewish privilege, because they have to serve in the army, they have to live in the Middle East, they have to be part of the Jewish people. I've been thinking about this incessantly and realizing that today, the American Jewish privilege is so real and everywhere and so prevalent that we need to be able to somehow bring in that responsibility. You know what? There was a past. There was a past that was very difficult and very harsh, and someone tried to destroy us. And that I think it's important not to lose that, especially as the survivors, and we're losing the survivors, and they're leaving this world and going on to the next world every year more and more. And we have few that are survivors that we can talk to. Somehow I feel that this 614th commandment needs to be on our sleeve. And that needs to be something that we can hold on to and say, yeah, there is a certain responsibility that I have, that God wanted me to be, me and my parents to be here, and my grandparents to be here, to live on to the next century.
I can't disagree with what you're saying. For me, it's a question of the motivation. Look, we're a people, the second commandment that he has. We're commanded, second, to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust, lest their memory perish. Long before the Holocaust, we talk about remembering. Even every Friday night, even on Shabbat, our most joyous day, we talk about Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, right? We talk about going out from Egypt. Zecher, remember, over and over again in all of our holidays. Rosh Hashanah, in my Reformed congregation, Shabbat attendance is okay. But on Rosh Hashanah, people come, and that is Yom HaZikaron. It's a day of remembrance. It's a day of memory. People come for Yizkor on Yom Kippur. They're coming to remember, Yizkor, to remember. So memory is woven into the fabric of being Jewish. And,
I'm going to cut you off. I'm going to cut you off for a second.
Cut me off.
How many people, on those who are coming on, let's say, Yizkor, for example, in particular, where it's our memory, not God. Yom HaZikaron is God's memory. I'm sorry, the day of Rosh Hashanah is God's memory. Yizkor is our memory of those. We ask God to remember. How many younger people are coming at this point? What's your demographics of your age of those who have attended Yizkor?
It's actually well attended. I mean, I don't have bar mitzvah kids there, right. But people who have lost loved ones are there. It's actually inspiring in a lot of ways. Look,
I'm seeing the opposite. I'm seeing that obviously we have a cross demographic as well, a range, but I'm seeing more that it's the younger people are not attending, even though I know that they lost loved ones.
Right.
And because they're less tied, that there's less responsibility of that
right.
religiously. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go on.
No, that's okay. Look, all four of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, all from Germany, all miraculously got out. Their stories for another time. But what my grandfather always taught me, and this is what I really take to heart, is that our obligation to the people who perished is to live life for those who couldn't. Not to fetishize their death and destruction, but to go back before that and to say, how did they live? What were the values that they held dear? What were their hopes and dreams? And how can we live those out, continue those values, those hopes and dreams? And that includes their Jewish hopes and dreams, their Jewish way of life. So perhaps it's not that far off from Fackenheim in the end. But to take these tragic events and to use them not to dwell in sackcloth and ashes on the death and destruction, but to use it as a motivation to embrace life and to embrace Jewish life and Jewish living in a way that honors the memory instead of fetishizing the death. And that comes back to my problem in Fackenheim's formulation of denying Hitler a posthumous victory. That ultimately is not the reason that we should do these four things. We should do these four things to live the lives for those who couldn't, and we should do these four things because Judaism in and of itself and the Jewish people in and of itself is worthy of our commitment, having nothing to do with it.
Right. So I think, and in Fackenheim's defense, I think that especially the last two, the forbidden to deny or despair of God and forbidden to despair of the world, you're dealing with the post-Holocaust. I don't remember when he wrote this, but you're dealing with the post-Holocaust era.
1970.
Okay, so it's still very fresh, right? 40 years ago, from almost 50 years ago, still very fresh, still very real. And there's still, I lived in Montreal where there was one of the largest concentration of Holocaust survivors in the world. And you would talk to people and they would say, all these years later, they would say, where was God? Where's mankind? Elie Wiesel's response was, of blessed memory, his response was, when they asked him how he could believe in God after the Holocaust, and he said, the bigger question is, how can I believe in man after the Holocaust? These are questions, theological questions, just that wrestled with, especially 50 years ago, 25 years after the Shoah, and they're still very present. And I think what Fackenheim is telling us is that rather than look at what had happened and the worst atrocity in the history of mankind and despair both at God and mankind, we have to use it. We have, especially 50 years ago, we have to use it as motivation and say, no, I'm not going to let the world. I'm not going to walk around with this black cloud. I'm going to live life to the fullest, as you said, because that's how these people lived beforehand, and that's what they deserve.
Yeah.
So I think Fackenheim's work is important.
I
think it was important 50 years ago, but I'm starting to think that 2 generations later, it's just as important. and I think if you asked me this 10 years ago, I think I would have been turned off by this. And here again, maybe in what I'm seeing in the world, and in response to this sense of privilege and a cutoff of the past that people have, and a lack of sense of identity, I think it's become more important than it ever has been.
Yeah. No, I think you're probably right about that. It's a challenge, and it's going to become more and more challenging. I see the kids in our religious school, and for them, the Holocaust is ancient history. It almost might as well be, Civil War era or Revolutionary War era. We have a couple of survivors in the congregation, and we have a couple of people who come back, not in the congregation, but who come and share their stories. But it's, like you said, not as present as it might have been in Montreal when you started your rabbinate. It's not as evident. So that's where the memory part comes in, and we have to make sure that this next generation remembers, and we have to make sure that that memory doesn't result in either a distancing from Judaism and the Jewish people, and we have to make sure that the memory inspires Jewish living as opposed to inspires fetishizing of death and destruction.
And I think Fackenheim pushes that, especially in his last 2 aspects of it, of the importance of, I will not allow the world to be despair. I will not give up hope on mankind and on God. Yeah. And even during this dark cloud, I still refuse to allow the world, me to be embittered to the world, which, as I said, today, and everything that's going on in the world, and everything that has happened in the last number of years, I think it speaks loudly than ever before.
I think you're right. Okay. Well, I hope you have a meaningful Yom HaShoah.
Thank you as well. I also want to, just one small comment is that, there's a whole discussion about, when you talk about fetishizing the Shoah, and there was an article in the Jewish Week about the museums and how many more museums have been popping up, Holocaust museums, which are ever important. I remember Rabbi Shalom Riskin talking about this and saying, you cannot have a monument or a museum of the Holocaust without seeing the next chapter of the story, which is next week's Yom HaAtzmaut. It has to be part of the story. And too many people have some sort of remembrance for Yom HaShoah, and they fail to recognize the miracle of the 70th anniversary of Yom HaAtzmaut, which we're going to be celebrating next week, which we'll talk about next week as well. This is just the first chapter of our sacred text. There will be a part B, and that's next week, and it's ever important that everyone participate in that as well. all of our 3 listeners out there.
That's right. Okay. Thanks a lot, Ira. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too, Howie.